Okay, hi everybody. It's 4 in the afternoon here in Southeast Queensland in Australia. It's 9 a.m. in Israel, and thanks for those joining from elsewhere, other places in Australia and elsewhere. I'd like that we acknowledge the Jagera people and the Turrbal people here in Southeast Queensland, the Brisbane area. They're the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today and Indigenous people throughout the world. It's a great pleasure to have Ariel Knafo-Noam present today. He's from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and we're looking forward to hear what he will tell us about the development of children's values. Thanks a lot, Ariel. All yours.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming to this talk and listening. And I'd like to talk about something I've been working on for many years, but I think now we're on a breakthrough. So I have to acknowledge that this is being funded by the Breakthrough Research Grant program of the Israel Science Foundation. And the topic is broadly defined development of children's values, but I'll talk about what I mean by children later on. I mean, when do we talk about children's values? What age are we talking about? So why are we interested in values? We're interested in values because values are good, positive things as we see them, although they can lead to many different kinds of behaviors. They are defined as desirable goals, positive abstract goals, positive ways of thinking about the world. So, for example, we could talk about somebody who's frightened, but they would have the value of carefulness. We can talk about somebody who's who's cheap. We could talk about the value of thriftiness. So it's how we positively think about things in the world. They can be moral values, they can be less moral values. They vary in importance. It's important because, for example, being careful, the value of carefulness could vary between people, across people. Some people would think it's a very important value, others less. And it can also value by culture. Cultures are different in what they value. An important aspect of values is that they're organized based on compatibility. So some values work together, such as carefulness and healthy are both values of security and cleanliness. They all represent the desire to keep things intact. And values can be in conflict with each other. For example, being careful and being daring or adventure are values that are opposed to each other. Values are supposed to be transsituational, applied across contexts. And why we're interested in values is mainly because they guide behavior. So we use values as guides to what to do, to choose between behaviors, and also how to evaluate political candidates, other people's behaviors, maybe even ourselves. When we do something that's against our values, maybe you don't feel that well because this is what values are. We use them to evaluate. As I said, values have different motivations, and one of the most replicable findings in social sciences ever is the Schwartz value circle, and that circle has been shown across different countries. Of course, in Australia, which was one of the pioneers of value research, Norman Feather from Flinders and others, but also in many other countries, from Fiji to Canada, we see the same circle of values that represent different motivations. You have the definitions here. I don't have the time to go over every single definition, but we have two main dimensions. One of them is self-enhancement, which is caring for myself, versus self-transcendence, which is caring for others. And the other one is conservation, conservatism, tradition, security, conformity to social norms, as opposed to openness to change, excitement, novelty, and independence. And this structure has been shown in many different countries. It started with adults, then it's been shown also with adolescents. So it's probably a universal. Just because the structure is there in every culture doesn't mean that every culture values the same things. So in every culture, we'll have a distinction between conservatism and openness, but some cultures are more conservative and other cultures are more open. And the values also represent a deeper aspect of our psychology, and this is important for the end of the talk. For example, we have a distinction between values that promote social focus and those that promote personal focus, and values that promote avoidance of things. For example, security is about avoiding dangerous things, and values that promote growth or approaching things. For example, daring is about approaching adventure. And importantly, as I said, values are related to many behaviors, and this is just a very, very brief list. So, for example, values of conservatism are associated with compliance, and values of power are associated with aggression, and so on. Empathy and prosocial behaviors are associated with values of benevolence and universalism, of caring for others. We'll see an example for that later. And this is why I'm interested in values originally. But as I'll say later, maybe it also goes the other way around. Maybe values are also the result of behavior rather than just the origin of behavior. There are three common assumptions in value development research. All of these assumptions go back almost a century or to the middle of the 20th century. For example, values developed during adolescence. This is very strongly influenced by a very powerful theory of Erik Erikson, who said that we have psychosocial stages in our development, and an important part of our development is to develop an identity, which includes our social identity, sexual identity, religious identity, and so on. And by that, it also includes our values. So a lot of research on value development is focused on specifically on adolescence. And for example, already 20 years ago, people showed the circle of values in adolescence, and I've done a lot of work on what happens to values in adolescence and how adolescents' values are related to their behaviors and so on. But that's just an assumption. It took a long time before people started asking, okay, what happens before adolescence? Another assumption is that values are an acquired cultural form, that they're influenced mainly by socialization in the family, and you get it from your culture. Where do you get your values from? From your household. I did my PhD on how parents and children how parents affect their children's values. Okay, and it was really rare. It's really rare to see people question that possibility. For example, maybe parents also are influenced by their children. And finally, values influence behaviors. I showed some associations between values and behaviors. Is it possible that values are affected by behaviors and not only affect behaviors? So I'll go very quickly over that. This is a conversation I had with my daughter. At the time, Elad Daniel from the Tel Aviv University and Anna Doring from the University of Westminster and I were working on a special issue on values development. And we were concerned by this notion that values develop only in adolescence. And Anna developed a measure of values in childhood. And now there's another measure developed in Australia at the University of Western Australia by Julie Lee, John Snedden, and other colleagues. And we saw that there are values also in younger ages. So, for example, I had this lovely conversation with my daughter. She was 6 at the time. And eventually she gave me her list of values: having fun, love is after having fun, happy is after love, and care is after happy. So this tells us that children can have a very sophisticated hierarchy of values at a very, very young age, much before Erikson would expect. Although Erikson was more sophisticated than that and also allowed values in childhood. So we said maybe there's something important going on even before adolescence, and there's been some work on that, mainly in Israel, Australia, and in Europe, showing evidence for values. For example, this is a measure by Anna Doring, and children get these cartoons, and the cartoons have an image that is culturally appropriate, and the caption, and then they have to rank it. Okay, and we have an app now that we developed. Aisha Maslamani, who's my doctoral student, is Palestinian, and she developed the measure in Arabic and Hebrew, and we now have a paper about Palestinian and Israeli children, and we find the same circle in children. So this is from another study only on Israeli children, that we replicated this with Palestinian and Israeli children. Again, even at the age of 5, we get the same Schwartz circle already at the age of 5, which is amazing for something that's supposedly developed in adolescence. So obviously, we can rule out the notion that values develop only in adolescence. Children at the age of 5 already have a value system that represents the contradictions and compatibilities among values. And I think this is a very important finding, and it's been replicated already also in Australia and in other countries. And now the app exists already in Arabic, Hebrew, English, Estonian, soon to be in Brazilian, Portuguese, and Russian. So and we'll see what happens, but I'm sure that the study will be replicated. And here is Julie, Q, for joining us. A lot of this work on value development in childhood was done in Australia, and I'm very grateful for this collaboration. And so, just for an example, to see that children's values mean something, this is a study we did at the Israel Science Museum with children of age 5 to 8, and we gave them an opportunity to share chocolate with their peers, somebody who was not in the room. And for all children, or on average, children tended to value self-transcendence more than they value self-enhancement. But those children who didn't give any chocolate to the other child showed a very small difference between self-transcendence, caring for others, and self-enhancement, caring for myself. Whereas the children who gave 3 or 4 chocolates out of 4, this chocolate in 3 out of 4 opportunities or more, showed a much bigger difference between self-transcendence and self-enhancing values. So we see that children act upon their values, even though it's not just that they see them in a separate way, but they use them similarly to adults. This is a finding that would be typical for adults, and we see it also with children. But of course, value development goes on later on. So this is again, these are results that we analyzed recently, and we published, in an organized way, and we can see that the consistency of values, this is in green, this is Australian children. We can see that the consistency of values goes up from the age of 5 to the age of 10, then it stabilizes, and the stability across time, a 1-year stability. These are Polish children by Jan Tuchek, and we can see that also the stability goes up with age and remains about the same towards adolescence. Maybe even a little bit goes down. So we see that value development is a process that goes on and on. There is already something very meaningful by the age of 5, but it still goes on later. So we can check out that values development in adolescence. I don't have much time, so I'll go very quickly over the second one. Values are an acquired cultural product. Here's an example from representative samples these are adults from Germany and Israel. These are achievement values. This is the strongest difference in values between Israel and Germany from representative samples from the European Social Survey. And as you can see, there is a significant difference. You have thousands of people in each of the countries that participated, but it's a very small difference. So even though this is the largest difference between the two countries. So indeed, Israelis are more achievement-oriented than Germans. But as you can see, we have bell curves in both countries, and we have distributions, and we see that many Israelis are lower than the average German, and many Germans are higher than the average Israelis. So there is more difference within culture than between culture. This is my point here. And this tells us that it's not enough to know which culture the person is from. A lot of it can have to do actually with individual differences. And these individual differences can be due to family differences. They can be due to life changes and so on. I don't want to talk about that too much, but it's a complex set of findings of effects that affect individual differences in values. It's not just which culture you're from. And one possibility is to look at genetic differences. So I know that many people don't think that values might be heritable to a certain extent, but actually there is some evidence to show that. And what we do to address this is we use what we call the twin design, the classic twin design. We have twins who are together, who grew up together, and they can be either monozygotic, that means identical twins who share virtually all of their DNA, or they could be fraternal twins, not identical twins who share on average 50% of the genetic variability. And if the twins are more, and we assume that they get their environments, some of their environment is shared, and this is shared to a similar extent by both kinds of twins. And we have the environment that's not shared by twins, which is not shared similarly by both kinds of twins. And we can use that to estimate the contribution of genetic and environments to individual differences across, not just within twins, but in everybody. But we just rely on having twin data to do that. This is how it looks. This is a review by my doctoral student, Luis Twito. And you can see the results for people from Germany, Australia, Israel, Canada, USA. And as you can see, on average, in all of those studies, the values tend to be more closely correlated in monozygotic twins than in dizygotic twins. There's one or two outliers, but overall the picture is very clear that monozygotic twins are more similar in their values than dizygotic twins. And this is again, this goes to say that some of the individual differences we have in values are actually the result of genetic differences. Obviously, I don't argue that there are genes for values, but there are genetic effects that affect our brain structure and function. And these genetic effects in brain structure and function are reflected in how we behave and how we feel and how we react to the world. And that eventually becomes our values. I'll get to that in a second. This relates to our topic of to the third assumption that values influence behaviors. And one thing that always bothered me is, okay, if values influence behaviors, for example, we have a study that says that individual differences in aggression at school are related to values. We show that, replicated it in Israel, among Palestinian Israelis. It's been replicated in Italy, in other countries. What does it mean? Do our values guide our behavior? Obviously, this is how we interpret it. But another possibility is to say, wait a minute, we have stable individual differences in aggression that emerge in the first year of life, maybe the second year of life. The minute that children have the ability for locomotion and for doing other independent things, some of them are more aggressive than others. And this reflects their temperament. So obviously, we can't say that their values affect their aggression at the age of 2. So the question is it possible that these individual tendencies to behave in certain ways affect our values? For example, empathy is a trait that we have shown emerges very early in the first year of life, and it shows some stability. And of course, empathy is related to thinking about others and caring about others, but the tendency for empathy emerges much earlier than the values. So what we did is we started thinking about this in terms of whether values actually arise from behaviors, from behavioral dispositions, from temperamental tendencies that occur very early on in development. And this is the study we're doing now. I'm afraid I don't have the time to go into all the details. I'm just going to say that this is not a new idea. Dan McAdams, who is an American expert in personality development, described this as 3 levels, 3 layers of personality. And he says this, the lower layer that starts already at the age of 0. These are traits and roles. We call it dispositional traits, how we behave. This is before we can think about this, before we can organize this in ideas and values, we show individual differences. And on top of that, there is the person as agent, and that's our goals and values. Identities, you could say, once we start organizing this in our personality, we start thinking about this, and then this becomes our values. So he put it around the age of 5. And finally, we have life narratives. I won't be talking about that. But we have layers that are built on each other. And we said, okay, let's start doing this as early as possible. I mean, we've shown already, Julie Lee and her colleague also have shown that values can be shown very early, age of 5, maybe slightly earlier. We have measures that show that. Can we even go younger than that? So this idea we borrowed from Jan Chuchik, but we made totally different versions of that. And here we have children as young as 1.5 come to our lab. And one thing they do, they watch this video of very cute teddy bears distinguished by the color of the ribbon. I don't know, here we don't see the difference, but there is a difference. And one of the bears says, and they start by seeing one bear say, I like chocolate, and then the other says, I like cucumbers, and then we ask the child, what do you like? So we get the child used, the infant or the baby or the child, we get the child used to the situation of choosing things. They like chocolate, they like cucumber. 80% of the kids like chocolate, 20% like cucumber, if anybody's interested in the answer to that, and so on. And then we ask them about more serious things. For example, I like it when someone tells me an adventure story I haven't heard before. So this is preference for novelty, openness to change. And the other one says, I like it. It's always that the beginning of the sentence is the same. I like it when someone tells me my favorite bedtime story. So this is actually conservation. Let's keep it as it's been all the time. So this is a distinction between openness to change and conservation. And what happens is that children, already at the age of 1.5, although I have to say that the little ones are not very good at that task, make these distinctions. And we can see some of the Schwartz structure already at the age of 2, 3 with this measure. And for example, just one example, children high on the temperament trait of surgency, which is activity, exuberance, and so on, are less likely to choose their favorite daytime story. They're more likely to choose I haven't heard before. So something in their temperament as rated by their parents is related to what they value in the birth task, which tells us that there is some evidence that children's temperament provides some basis for the later developing values. So we have a theoretical conception that says that values start from genetic effects, which affect our behavioral dispositions, our empathy, fear, aggression, and other individual differences. There is a process, cognitive process of ideation, thinking about values, relating them to the self, reasoning, and so on. There is, of course, socialization. Parents are very important. Culture is very important, and they affect the tendencies. In some culture, being fearful is very easily translated to security. In other cultures, people don't like that their children are fearful. They try to tell them to behave differently, and so on. So values could become very different. Eventually, with development, these become the values that we know. Let me just conclude. Values emerge early in development, maybe in middle childhood, maybe even earlier. They're partially heritable. They relate meaningfully to behavioral traits. And something I didn't show, we can predict values by early temperament. So we can take 3-year-old temperament and predict values at the age of 8 and 9 with some fancy statistical models that I don't even know how to run, but the students know. So this supports our disposition to position model. Start with the disposition, it becomes our position on things. Okay, I'll just skip that and I'll thank my collaborators and my students, funders. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Ariel. I'm clapping in the name of the listeners, both now online and probably later on YouTube. There are already some questions. I'll actually start to read them from the chat, and once we go through that, if there are others, feel free to either ask or put your question in the chat. So the first question is, does the spread within societies follow some trend, like average age of population, geographical places, etc.?
If the question is about cultural differences, then the answer is yes. So there's been lots of work. It's not my field, but there's been lots of work relating cultural differences in values to geographic effects, historical effects. So, for example, Australia is more related in its values to other countries with original, cultures originating from what is now the UK. So they're more similar to Ireland than to I don't know. The closest country to Australia would be, I don't know, Indonesia or something like that. So much closer to the USA, Canada, and so on. So there's something about historical effects. Even if you go in Europe, you will see differences between countries that were historically Orthodox Christian and countries that were historically Catholic Christian. So there's some evidence for very long-term effects of cultural and geographical heritage.
Got you. Thank you. So now we have a question. How malleable are values once they are formed? So how flexible are they?
It's a great question. I don't think we have a very, very strong evidence base for that, but we know that values become, as I showed, increasingly stable. So it means that if you don't do anything about any intervention, people become increasingly similar to themselves. There is a caveat here because I think there are turning points. So, for example, what the graph I showed ends up in early adolescence, and we have evidence which has been unpublished yet, but we have some evidence and some reason to support that actually there's a drop in stability at the beginning of adolescence because everything is reorganized at the beginning of adolescence. So you have puberty, you have new schools, you have differences in social relationships that children undergo. So probably stability goes down. And maybe later on, for example, in late adulthood, after retirement, you will see a similar finding. It hasn't been studied, but that would be my guess. Or I don't know if it's been studied, that would be my guess. And so maybe these are periods where values are more malleable. They undergo some important changes. And but I don't think there's evidence for a very, very strong effect of environment. So, for example, if you study people who transitioned into a profession, and you'll find differences in the values of psychologists and engineers, for example. This has been shown repeatedly, but these effects usually come from our selection. So people who become psychologists have different values than people who become engineers. And being in a psychology setting affects your values to a certain extent, but it's a weaker effect than the effect of choosing yourself into a profession. So values are not very malleable. And there's been also some work on educational interventions in values, and I think it hasn't been very promising.
Gotcha. Thank you. I also have a question, but maybe somebody else wants to ask something.
Could I ask a follow-up question? Hi, it's Helena Robinson here. Thank you. So that's so interesting, Ariel. I was actually really interested to hear your final point that there's some research on educational interventions and that it's not very promising. I'm involved in a project looking at museum Holocaust education and what impact that has long-term on the formation of things like values. So maybe afterwards, if you have any, or if you can throw any references my way, that would be really appreciated.
I think I don't want to appear as if I said that values cannot be changed through intervention. I just said that we did some literature reviews on the topic, and we didn't find that the current interventions that are common in schools are very efficient. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be efficient interventions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Helena. Are there other questions? So, Ariel, I have a question, and it has to do with actually the value of values, so the gain we get from values, independent of what they are. So is there research or knowledge that actually having some set of values, no matter, and living by it, sticking by it, being aware of it, cognizant of it, is kind of beneficial to the individual, even if those values, can vary across cohorts?
It's a great question. I think there are two ways to address this. I mean, two major approaches. One of them says, okay, we have healthy values. And this has been promoted by some theories saying, for example, that caring for others is a good value, and autonomy is a good value, and so on. And this approach has been criticized as being very Western oriented in terms of values. In some cultures, autonomy is not that important. But they have their evidence showing that at least in some cultures, people who have these tendencies are more, have better well-being, for example. I think that the evidence is more for some kind of culturally relevant values. Like if you fit your environment, then you're more likely to benefit from it in terms of your well-being. So if you're very autonomous in a society that doesn't value autonomy at all, you might have a very difficult life. Theories of fit are also very common, and I think they fare better. For example, we know that people who are religious and who live in religious contexts are better off than people who are religious who live in non-religious contexts, and vice versa. And we've been showing it. We're working on a paper that shows that across different cultures, and it doesn't matter if it's Jews or Christians or Muslims, you get about the same finding. And even now we're working on something that relates fit between people's personality traits and their values. And there is some work that shows that, for example, achievement values are more likely to be important to people who are very extroverted than people who are very introverted. So what happens if you're an introvert and you're very high on achievement values? And these people are, on average, have lower self-esteem. This is unpublished work, so maybe I did it out later on from the recording. But if your values fit either your external environment or maybe your internal traits, you're more likely to feel good about yourself than if your values are very different from what people are expecting from you, or maybe what you're expecting from yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very, very good. Yeah, well, we found this to be an excellent talk. No pun intended, it was very valuable. And I think everybody on this talk also values academic freedom. And we can see you're great collaborators on this project. And I'm sure that some people either online or following the YouTube will make contact with Ariel and will continue collaboration. Wishing you a good day and good after Ariel, as you start your day in Israel. Good afternoon here to the people in Australia or others elsewhere in the world. And thanks so much. See everybody in other Australia Israel Scholar Seminar series. Thank you, Ariel.
It was my pleasure.
Okay, I'll stop the recording. Oh, okay. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.